Look at your arm for a moment. Not your shirt, not your watch, just your skin. Whether it's very dark, light brown, olive, tan, or pale enough to show every vein beneath the surface, you're looking at one of the oldest survival tools your ancestors ever evolved. Most people think skin color is just appearance. It isn't. It's biology written on the outside of your body. It's a record of sunlight. It's a map of migration. And hidden inside every shade of human skin is a story that began long before cities, before farming, before language as we know it, before the first cave paintings, before anyone had ever imagined building a civilization. It began in Africa. About 300,000 years ago, the earliest known Homo sapiens appeared there. Fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco show that by this time, our species already possessed many of the characteristics that define us today. But there was one feature almost every researcher agrees these early humans shared: dark skin. Not because of culture, not because of chance, because at that moment in history, dark skin was one of the most valuable adaptations a human body could possess. And that's strange when you think about it. Because if skin color could change so dramatically over time, then it raises an obvious question. What exactly was it changing in response to? The answer isn't people. It isn't climate alone. It isn't even evolution by itself. It's sunlight. More specifically, invisible ultraviolet radiation. And that story starts much earlier than Homo sapiens. Long before our species existed, our distant ancestors looked far more like modern apes than modern humans. They had smaller brains, longer arms, and bodies covered with thick hair. That hair did something important. It blocked sunlight before it ever reached the skin. Modern chimpanzees still work this way today. Beneath their dark hair, much of their skin is surprisingly light because the fur acts as their first line of defense. But somewhere between roughly 1 and 2 million years ago, something remarkable happened in our lineage. Our ancestors began losing most of that body hair. Scientists still debate every reason why. Some researchers point toward improved cooling during long-distance movement. Others suggest fewer parasites living in dense fur. Most likely, several evolutionary pressures worked together. Whatever the exact combination, the result was extraordinary. Humans became one of the least hairy mammals of our size. And suddenly something changed. The sun no longer struck fur, it struck living skin. Imagine standing near the equator with almost no clothing, no sunscreen, no shade for hours, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. Africa receives some of the highest levels of ultraviolet radiation anywhere on Earth. Without protection, UV radiation damages DNA inside skin cells. Every exposure creates tiny injuries. Most are repaired, some are not. Over time, the damage accumulates. Your ancestors couldn't simply avoid the sun. The sun was where survival happened. Hunting happened there. Gathering happened there. Travel happened there. Life happened there. Evolution needed another solution. Fortunately, it already existed: melanin. Melanin is a pigment produced by specialized skin cells called melanocytes. Think of it as millions of microscopic umbrellas. Instead of blocking rain, they absorb and scatter ultraviolet radiation before it penetrates deeper into the body. The more melanin your skin contains, the darker your skin appears. But darkness wasn't the goal. Protection was. Anthropologist Nina Jablonski and geographer George Chaplin spent years studying indigenous populations around the world. Their research revealed one of the clearest biological patterns found in humanity. The closer populations traditionally lived to the equator, the darker their average skin pigmentation. The farther they lived from intense tropical sunlight, the lighter pigmentation generally became. It wasn't random. It followed ultraviolet radiation almost like a shadow follows a person. That relationship appears again and again across continents, which tells us something important. Skin color wasn't evolving because humans wanted different appearances. It was evolving because sunlight kept asking the body the same question: can you survive here? Every generation answered slightly differently. But here's something many people never hear. Protecting DNA wasn't the only reason dark skin mattered. There was another molecule quietly influencing human evolution: folate, vitamin B9. You probably know folate because doctors recommend it during pregnancy. There's a very good reason for that. In the earliest weeks of embryonic development, folate helps the neural tube close properly. That tiny structure eventually becomes the brain and spinal cord. Without enough folate, serious developmental problems become much more likely. Scientists have also shown that intense ultraviolet exposure can reduce circulating folate levels. That means high UV environments created another evolutionary challenge: protect the body's folate, or risk reduced reproductive success. Suddenly, melanin wasn't protecting just one thing. It was helping defend multiple biological systems at once. Your ancestors didn't know any of this. They didn't understand vitamins. They didn't understand DNA. They didn't know what ultraviolet radiation even was. Evolution didn't require understanding, only survival. Generation after generation, individuals whose bodies handled intense sunlight more effectively left more descendants. Slowly, almost invisibly, those protective traits became increasingly common. Over immense spans of time, dark skin became the ancestral condition for our species. For hundreds of thousands of years, nearly every Homo sapiens who walked the earth carried that same adaptation. Think about the scale. Every family, every child, every storyteller, every hunter, every parent, every grandmother, every campfire conversation, every footprint pressed into ancient African soil. Dark skin wasn't one variation among many. It was simply what being human looked like. If you could somehow travel back 200,000 years, skin color would probably not be the feature that surprised you most, but it would be one of the few characteristics shared by virtually everyone you met. That wasn't because evolution had finished. Far from it. Evolution never finishes. It only responds. And eventually, something happened that completely changed the question sunlight was asking. Humans began leaving Africa, not all at once, not as one enormous migration. Families moved. Children settled farther away. Grandchildren explored farther still. Over thousands of years, those small journeys slowly carried our species into environments unlike anything our ancestors had ever experienced. And without anyone realizing it, the greatest experiment in human skin color had just begun. I'd love to hear which discovery changed the way you think about your own skin. And if you're fascinated by the forgotten history written into the human body, consider subscribing. There are still hundreds of thousands of years of our story left to uncover. As humans slowly spread out of Africa, they weren't chasing a grand plan. No one stood at the edge of the continent and said, "Let's build civilizations." No one knew there were continents waiting beyond the horizon. It happened one family at a time. A group followed migrating animals a little farther than their parents had. Their children settled somewhere new. Their grandchildren explored another valley, another coastline, another river, then another. Generation after generation, these tiny movements slowly carried our species across the Middle East, into Europe, across Asia, and eventually into Australia and the Americas. For the people making those journeys, nothing seemed dramatic. But for evolution, everything had changed. Because although humans were moving only a few kilometers at a time, the sun wasn't staying the same. Think about standing outside at noon near the equator. The sunlight feels intense. The shadows are short. Within minutes, your skin begins warming. Now imagine standing outside on a winter afternoon in Northern Europe. The sun hangs low in the sky. Its light passes through much more of Earth's atmosphere before reaching you. Much of the ultraviolet radiation is scattered or absorbed before it ever touches your skin. The same sun. A completely different environment. This wasn't something your ancestors could see. Ultraviolet radiation is invisible, but their bodies could feel its effects every single day. For hundreds of thousands of years, evolution had rewarded skin that blocked powerful tropical sunlight. Now, in higher latitudes, that same protection created an entirely new problem. And here's the part almost nobody talks about. Dark skin didn't suddenly become bad. Africa hadn't changed. Dark skin was still one of the best possible adaptations for life under intense ultraviolet radiation. The environment changed, the rules changed. Evolution simply responded. The story isn't about one skin color replacing another, it's about one successful adaptation meeting a completely different world. Scientists often describe evolution as a series of trade-offs. Almost every adaptation solves one problem while creating another. Polar bears have thick insulating fur that keeps them alive in Arctic winters. Move that same bear into the Sahara Desert, and its greatest advantage becomes a serious disadvantage. Neither environment is better. The adaptation simply matches one environment more closely than another. Human skin followed the same principle. Near the equator, abundant melanin acted like an extraordinary natural shield. Farther north, something unexpected happened. The shield became so effective that it began blocking something the body desperately needed: vitamin D. Today, many people think of vitamin D as just another supplement sitting on a pharmacy shelf. To your ancestors, it was something far more important. It was essential for survival. Unlike most vitamins, your body can actually manufacture vitamin D, but it needs help. When ultraviolet B radiation reaches the skin, it triggers a chain of chemical reactions that eventually produce vitamin D. Without enough UVB reaching the skin, production drops dramatically. That matters because vitamin D helps your body absorb calcium from food. Without enough calcium entering the bloodstream, bones cannot mineralize properly. Children can develop rickets. Their growing bones become soft. Legs bend under body weight. Growth slows. The skeleton weakens. Adults can develop osteomalacia, where bones lose strength and become painful and fragile. For women in ancient populations, weakened pelvic bones could make childbirth significantly more dangerous. These weren't rare inconveniences. Before modern medicine, they could determine whether families survived. Now imagine a hunter-gatherer family arriving in northern Europe roughly 40,000 years ago. Their ancestors evolved under some of the brightest sunlight on Earth. Their skin contained large amounts of protective melanin. That protection had served countless generations, but northern Europe offered something entirely different. Long winters, short daylight hours, cloud-covered skies, months with very little ultraviolet radiation. The skin that had once protected them so effectively now faced a difficult challenge. It blocked much of the limited UVB available for vitamin D production. Researchers studying indigenous populations have repeatedly found that ultraviolet intensity closely predicts long-term patterns of skin pigmentation around the world. The farther populations traditionally lived from the equator, the lighter their average skin pigmentation generally became. Not immediately, not everywhere, and certainly not all at once. Evolution rarely works that way. Instead, random genetic mutations constantly appeared in every generation. Most disappeared, some had no noticeable effect, but occasionally a mutation slightly reduced melanin production. Under African sunlight, that change likely offered little advantage. Sometimes it may even have been harmful. In northern environments, however, something remarkable happened. Those individuals could produce slightly more vitamin D from limited sunlight. The difference might have been small, but evolution doesn't require dramatic improvements. It only requires one version to reproduce slightly more successfully than another. Perhaps one child survived winter. Perhaps one mother recovered more easily after childbirth. Perhaps one family produced one extra generation. Those tiny differences accumulate, generation after generation, century after century, millennium after millennium. This is something many people misunderstand about evolution. Evolution doesn't have goals. It isn't trying to make humans lighter. It isn't trying to make humans darker. It isn't trying to make anything at all. It simply preserves whatever traits happen to improve survival and reproduction under current conditions, change the environment, and the favored traits often change too. That simple principle explains an astonishing amount of human history. But here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. Scientists once believed lighter skin appeared gradually as soon as humans entered Europe. It seemed logical. Less sunlight should favor less melanin. Simple. Except ancient DNA told a very different story. When researchers began sequencing genomes from prehistoric skeletons, they discovered something completely unexpected. Many of Europe's earliest hunter-gatherers still had relatively dark skin. For thousands of years after arriving in Europe, lighter skin remained surprisingly uncommon. One of the most famous discoveries came from Gough's Cave in southwestern England. There, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a man who lived about 10,000 years ago. Today, he is known simply as Cheddar Man. When scientists analyzed his ancient DNA, they estimated that he most likely had dark to dark brown skin, blue eyes, and dark hair. To modern eyes, that combination looks unusual, but only because we've become accustomed to seeing blue eyes paired with very pale skin. 10,000 years ago, human appearance looked different. That discovery transformed our understanding of European prehistory. It showed that moving north alone wasn't enough to immediately produce pale skin. Something else was happening. Something that would eventually reshape millions of people across an entire continent. And strangely enough, it had almost nothing to do with hunting. It had everything to do with farming. Because once humans stopped following wild animals and began growing crops, their bodies faced another evolutionary challenge that almost nobody saw coming, a challenge hidden inside everyday food. We'll explore that in the next part. Before we continue, I'd love to know what surprised you most. Was it that darker skin remained common in Europe for thousands of years? Or that evolution doesn't move toward a goal but simply responds to changing environments? Share your thoughts in the comments because your questions often inspire future videos. For thousands of years, the people of Europe remained hunters and gatherers. They followed migrating herds. They fished rivers. They collected berries, nuts, mushrooms, roots, and whatever the changing seasons offered. Their world moved with nature. And although sunlight was weaker than it had been in Africa, their diet quietly solved part of the vitamin D problem. Wild salmon, freshwater fish, shellfish, liver, kidneys, fat from wild animals. These foods naturally contain vitamin D, not enough to ignore sunlight completely, but enough to help. That meant evolution wasn't in a hurry. Yes, lighter skin offered advantages in northern climates, but people weren't surviving on sunlight alone. Food was helping carry part of the burden. Then something happened that completely changed human history, not just skin color. Everything. Agriculture. Around 10,000 years ago, small communities in the Fertile Crescent began cultivating wild grasses that eventually became wheat and barley. They domesticated goats, sheep, cattle. Over the next several thousand years, farming slowly spread into Europe. At first, it probably seemed like an incredible success. Food became more predictable. Villages became permanent. Populations grew larger than ever before. Children no longer had to spend their entire lives following migrating animals across enormous landscapes. For the first time, humans began reshaping nature instead of simply adapting to it. But every revolution comes with unexpected consequences. And farming carried one hidden cost that nobody could see. The human diet changed dramatically. Hunter-gatherers ate dozens, sometimes hundreds, of different foods throughout the year. Farmers depended increasingly on a handful of staple crops: bread, porridge, grains. These foods supplied calories, lots of them, but they supplied almost no vitamin D. Suddenly, millions of people were relying on sunlight much more than their ancestors ever had. Think about what this meant. The same dark skin that had protected generations from intense African sunlight now lived under cloudy northern skies. At the same time, the dietary safety net that had quietly provided extra vitamin D was disappearing. For the first time, skin alone had to solve the problem. And evolution noticed. This is where ancient DNA has completely transformed our understanding of human history. 20 years ago, scientists could only make educated guesses about what prehistoric people looked like. Today, researchers can recover fragments of DNA from skeletons buried thousands of years ago. Every new genome is like opening another page in humanity's forgotten diary. One of the scientists leading this revolution is geneticist David Reich at Harvard University. Along with researchers including Ian Matheson and many international collaborators, ancient DNA studies have revealed something extraordinary. Europe's population wasn't simply becoming lighter little by little. Instead, major migrations repeatedly reshaped the continent. New people arrived. They mixed with existing populations, and they carried different genetic variants influencing skin pigmentation. One of the most important genes involved is called SLC24A5. Another is SLC45A2. Neither gene created light skin by itself. Human pigmentation is controlled by many genes working together, but these particular variants became increasingly common among farming populations and later pastoral groups moving across Europe. Generation after generation, the frequency of lighter pigmentation increased. Not overnight, not because anyone preferred it. Simply because in those environments, individuals producing vitamin D more efficiently often enjoyed a small reproductive advantage. Evolution doesn't reward perfection. It rewards consistency. A tiny advantage repeated over thousands of generations eventually becomes impossible to ignore. And here's something remarkable. Europe wasn't unique. When scientists studied populations across Asia, they discovered something unexpected. Many East Asian populations also evolved lighter skin, but they didn't use exactly the same genetic changes. Different mutations, different evolutionary pathways, the same general outcome. Biologists call this convergent evolution. It's one of evolution's most fascinating patterns. Imagine asking several inventors to solve the same engineering problem without allowing them to communicate. One builds a bridge using steel, another uses stone, a third uses reinforced wood. Different designs, same destination. Evolution often works the same way. Separate populations encountered similar environmental challenges: lower ultraviolet radiation, greater dependence on vitamin D production. Natural selection found more than one genetic solution. That tells us something important. The pressure itself was real. Otherwise, evolution wouldn't have repeatedly arrived at similar answers. Skin color was never about one superior version replacing another. It was biology solving local environmental problems using whatever genetic variation happened to be available. And here's where modern genetics has overturned another common misunderstanding. Many people imagine skin color as though it's controlled by a single switch. Dark, light, one gene, one mutation. Reality is far more complicated. Researchers have identified dozens of genes influencing pigmentation. Some affect how much melanin the body produces. Others influence how melanin is packaged inside cells. Still others affect how pigment moves through the skin. Every person inherits a unique combination. That's why human skin exists along a continuous spectrum rather than fitting into neat biological categories. Nature rarely works in simple boxes. Human beings certainly don't. Now think about this. If you walked across Europe 8,000 years ago, you wouldn't see everyone looking the same. Some communities remained darker. Others were becoming lighter. Eye colors varied. Hair colors varied. Genetic diversity was already enormous. The idea that ancient populations match today's national identities simply isn't supported by archaeology or genetics. Our ancestors were constantly moving, meeting, trading, marrying, migrating. Human history has always been a story of connection, not isolation. Perhaps the most famous reminder of this is Cheddar Man. When his genome was reconstructed, many people were surprised that someone living in Britain around 10,000 years ago likely had dark skin and blue eyes. But Cheddar Man wasn't unusual because he broke the rules. He was unusual because he reminded us that our assumptions about the past were wrong. Ancient humans didn't organize themselves according to the categories modern societies often imagine. Evolution was still experimenting, still responding, still changing. And here's the part that I find most remarkable. None of this happened because anyone chose it. No prehistoric community gathered together and decided lighter skin would be useful. Nobody voted, nobody planned it. Children simply inherited slightly different versions of genes from their parents. Some versions happened to work a little better in one environment than another. Those children survived, raised families, passed those genes onward. Over thousands of years, tiny differences became visible across entire continents. Evolution rarely announces itself. It whispers, one generation at a time, one family at a time, one child at a time, until eventually the world looks completely different from where it started. And yet, despite all these changes, every person alive today still carries the same ancient African inheritance. Every shade, every eye color, every hair color, every face, all branches of one remarkably young species. But the story still isn't finished. Because if skin color evolved so dramatically in the past, what happens now? Modern humans wear sunscreen, take vitamin D supplements, travel across continents in a single day, live under electric lights instead of the open sky. Have we changed the rules of evolution once again? That question may determine what future generations of humans look like thousands of years from now. Leave your answer in the comments. I read them all, and many of your ideas become future episodes. For hundreds of thousands of years, evolution shaped human skin with one simple goal: survive where you live. Nothing more, nothing less. There was never a perfect skin color. There was only the skin color that worked best under a particular sky. That's an important idea, because modern life makes it easy to forget how recently our ancestors lived at the mercy of nature. Today, if you move from Nigeria to Norway or from Sweden to Australia, you can buy sunscreen at the airport, you can take vitamin D supplements, you can eat salmon flown in from another continent, you can spend most of your day indoors under artificial lighting. For nearly all of human history, none of those options existed. Your body was on its own. The sun decided the rules. Evolution simply kept score. And yet, despite everything we've learned, there's one misconception that refuses to disappear. People often imagine human evolution as a ladder, as though one population became more advanced than another, as though lighter skin somehow replaced darker skin because it was better. Science tells a completely different story. Evolution doesn't build ladders. It builds branches. Every living human belongs to exactly the same species. We all share remarkably recent common ancestors. In fact, genetically, humans are one of the least diverse large mammals on Earth. Two chimpanzees living in the same forest often differ genetically more than two humans living on opposite sides of the planet. Think about that for a moment. The differences we notice most easily, skin color, eye color, hair texture, represent only a tiny fraction of our DNA. More than 99.9% of your genetic code is shared with every other person alive today. Whether someone's ancestors lived beneath the equatorial sun or inside the Arctic Circle, the overwhelming majority of what makes them human is exactly the same. The visible differences attract our attention. The similarities tell the real story. And perhaps the greatest similarity of all is where that story began: Africa. Every genetic study conducted over the past several decades points back to the same conclusion. Modern humans originated in Africa before gradually spreading across the rest of the world. That doesn't mean every population remained unchanged. Far from it. As people encountered deserts, mountains, rainforests, frozen tundra, tropical islands, and high-altitude plateaus, natural selection continued adjusting countless traits. Skin color was only one of them. Body proportions changed. Immune systems adapted to local diseases. Lactase persistence evolved in some pastoral populations, allowing adults to digest milk. High-altitude populations in Tibet and the Andes developed different physiological solutions for surviving with less oxygen. Evolution never stopped working. It simply responded to new environments. And that's what makes skin color so fascinating. It reminds us that our bodies aren't fixed. They're living records of thousands of generations responding to the world around them. Look at your own skin again. Whatever shade you inherited represents countless decisions made by nature long before your family tree had surnames. Not conscious decisions, statistical ones, tiny differences repeated over unimaginable stretches of time. Every ancestor who survived, every child who lived long enough to have children of their own, every generation quietly passing on traits that happen to work. Your skin isn't random, it's history, written in biology, but here's something even more remarkable. The evolutionary pressures that shaped human pigmentation have become weaker in many parts of the modern world. For most of history, sunlight determined whether your body produced enough vitamin D. Today, we can buy it in a bottle. For most of history, moving to another latitude meant your descendants would slowly adapt over many generations. Today, millions of people live successfully in environments completely different from those their ancestors evolved in. Technology has changed the relationship between biology and environment. We wear clothing that blocks ultraviolet radiation more effectively than melanin ever could. We build houses that protect us from weather our ancestors endured every day. We spend hours beneath electric lights instead of the open sky. Some researchers describe this as humans modifying their own selective pressures. We're not stopping evolution. Nothing can do that. Random mutations still occur. Genes are still inherited. Natural selection still operates. But the conditions influencing survival have changed dramatically. Medicine saves people who once would not have survived. Nutrition reaches places where famine once shaped entire populations. Global travel constantly mixes genetic lineages that remained separated for thousands of years. The human story is becoming more connected than ever before. And perhaps that's the most fitting ending imaginable. Because when scientists sequence ancient DNA, excavate prehistoric burials, or reconstruct migration routes from thousands of years ago, they keep arriving at the same conclusion. Human history isn't a story of separation. It's a story of movement. Movement across rivers, across deserts, across mountains, across continents. Every migration connected people who had once lived apart. Every generation carried pieces of previous generations into entirely new worlds. Even today, your DNA almost certainly contains fragments inherited from ancestors who lived in many different places over many different periods. Your family history is probably more complicated than any map could ever show. Which brings us back to the question we started with. Why did ancient humans go from black to white? The answer isn't because one skin color replaced another. The answer isn't because evolution was trying to improve humanity. The answer isn't because different groups became fundamentally different kinds of people. The answer is much simpler. Humans adapted. Dark skin evolved because intense African sunlight favored abundant melanin. Lighter skin later evolved in some populations because lower ultraviolet environments favored more efficient vitamin D production. Different environments, different challenges, different solutions, the same species. That's the part history sometimes forgets. For centuries, skin color became one of the most powerful ways societies divided themselves. Empires were built around it. Laws were written around it. People were judged by it. Wars were justified because of it. Yet biology tells a story almost completely opposite to those ideas. Skin color isn't evidence of separate origins. It's evidence of shared origins. Every shade on Earth traces back to the same African ancestors who walked beneath an equatorial sun hundreds of thousands of years ago. The diversity we see today isn't proof of separation. It's proof of adaptation. And adaptation is one of the greatest strengths our species has ever possessed. Our ancestors survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, changing climates, new diseases, new landscapes. Again and again, they adapted, not because they were stronger than nature, because they learned to live with it. Perhaps that's the lesson hidden inside our own skin. The color you inherited isn't simply a description of your appearance. It's the memory of places your ancestors once called home. It's sunlight preserved across generations. It's evolution still visible every time you look in the mirror. Thousands of years from now, future humans may look slightly different again. Natural selection will continue. Migration will continue. Genetic mixing will continue. No one knows exactly what humanity will look like 100,000 years from now. Evolution never publishes its plans in advance. But if the last 300,000 years have taught us anything, it's this. Being human has never meant staying the same. It has always meant changing, quietly, patiently, generation after generation. Until one day, someone looks into a mirror and unknowingly carries the story of an entire species on the surface of their skin. And maybe that's the strangest part of all. Every morning, without thinking about it, you look directly at one of the oldest historical documents that has ever existed. Not carved into stone, not painted on cave walls, not buried beneath ancient ruins, written into you. I'd love to know which discovery surprised you the most. Thanks for watching.